Hi, everyone. My name is Rick Hinojosa. Hi, Joshua. Welcome to the Festival Vegan de Montréal 2021 edition. Today, I'm honored to present Joshua Katcher. He's a fashion designer, author, and educator who has taught at Parsons and has lectured at universities internationally and lobbied in the United States for sustainable and ethical fashion. Katcher's award-winning book, The Fashion Animals, was published in 2019. He established the first vegan lifestyle website, The Discerning Brute, in 2008, and launched the first vegan, ethically made menswear fashion brand called Brave Gentleman in 2010, which has been featured in Vogue, Forbes, GQ, etc. The Financial Times and others. The Katcher's project Circumfauna highlights data-driven research and material innovations. He sits on the board of directors for the Collective Fashion Justice. He has won several awards, including Outstanding Innovator 2021 from the Fur Bearers, and and has been named the top most influential vegans of 2019 by Beg News magazine. Welcome, Joshua.
Thank you so much, Rick. Bonjour. Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. So I'll be giving a talk today called The Fashion Zoo, and I'm going to share my screen because there's a lot to get through, so I'm going to get started right away.
Fantastic.
Just clicking that. Okay. Does that look clear to you, Rick? You can
yeah,
see the.
Yeah, we see you, great. And we see the screen. It's perfect.
Awesome. So the talk that I give is called The Fashion Zoo. Just to give you a little background on me, as Rick mentioned, I wrote the book Fashion Animals, which is the first book to really look seriously at the intersection of animals and the fashion industry from a historical standpoint, from a sociological standpoint, and really from a fashion studies perspective. So this book hopefully is a great resource if anybody is interested in doing research on this topic or wants to do further research. This is a really great starting point. In addition to writing the book, I also write articles. I've written about the luxury fashion industry's connection to the illegal wildlife trade. I've written about COVID-19 and its connection to mink farms. And I've written about the future of fashion and what that's going to look like. Circumfauna is a project that I have with Collective Fashion Justice. This is a really wonderful resource. So if you're looking for data about animal material impacts, so for example, what is the climate impact of leather? What is the biodiversity impact of the wool industry? These are topics that we tackle at Circumfauna. Please check it out and feel free to use it for research. I'm on the board of directors for Collective Fashion Justice, and Collective Fashion Justice was started by Emma Hackinson in Australia, and this is a really wonderful organization that brings together issues from environmental perspectives, animal rights perspectives, and social justice perspectives. So this is a really important topic, and a really good example of looking at an issue regarding animal materials through this perspective is something like the wool industry, where you have issues ranging from the destruction of native lands to biodiversity loss, to the taking away of indigenous lands for wool farming, and then what happens to the sheep and the sheep processing. So this is all interconnected, all of these systems. I've also worked on legislation. So just last month, there was a law that was passed in New York City, and this is a piece of legislation that I worked on regarding environmentally preferable purchasing for the city when it comes to textiles. So this lobbying and working with legislators you know, in order to make the fashion industry better for animals and the environment, that's something that I do. I've testified at the New York City Council for a fur ban in New York City. This is something that's still ongoing, but we're still fighting to make it happen, and it's happening in a lot of other places. I also have my fashion brand, Brave Gentleman, which mostly is footwear, but we also do outerwear. And just to give you a little idea of what Brave Gentleman looks like, we were covered in Vogue magazine, and this is the actor Alan Cumming wearing Brave Gentleman looks. Everything that I make at Brave Gentleman is as sustainable as I can source. Everything's totally vegan and everything's made under fair labor conditions. So these suits, for example, are all made from bamboo fiber. So instead of wool, which suits are typically made out of wool, these are made from bamboo. These are some organic cotton shorts and shirts with a vegan suede motorcycle jacket vest. This is some of the footwear that we do. We're a really footwear heavy brand. So footwear is our main source of business. Some sneakers like this, for example, they are made from waste diverted cotton and waste diverted polyester. So we try as much as we can to use innovative materials and sustainable materials. Some other examples of things that we make. Getting back to my research, looking at fashion and animals, why is this something that's important? Well, there are 6 main reasons that I look at in my research. There's ecological impacts, there's ethical implications, there's historical significance, there are social and psychological consequences, business and economic effects, and design and innovation outcomes. And these are all valid reasons to look at the intersection of fashion and animals. Typically, when we look at the fashion industry, most of us only see the final product. We only see what's on the clothing rack, what's in the advertisement, what's on someone else or on us. But rarely do we see what goes on behind the curtain, what goes on in the supply chain. And brands who make fashion often intentionally want to hide what's going on behind that curtain. They don't want people to see it because if they saw it, they might be outraged, they might be disgusted, they might not want to purchase those things anymore. So if we were to raise that curtain and look behind it, it might look something like this. And here's a trigger warning. This section depicts images of animal cruelty and child labor. So if we were to look behind the curtain, it might look something like this. These are 2 young boys working in liming baths at an illegal tannery in Bangladesh. And these are baths of chemicals that are designed to make hair follicles fall out of skin. So when you think about leather, it starts off as a big hide with hair in it. And the way that you get smooth leather is to drench it in chemicals and scrape the hair out. Imagine what those chemicals are doing to living bodies. These boys are immersed in those chemicals. So this is a very dangerous situation regarding illegal child labor. Behind the curtain might look something like this. This is a waste pile of fox carcasses at a Russian fur farm. This is just considered waste because there's no industrial use for fox carcasses. So the fur industry likes to hide images like this. And also like this. This is a dumpster at a Spanish rabbit fur farm. Often when animals are sick on fur farms, it's far cheaper to simply throw them in the garbage than it is to get them veterinary care. So if an animal has a damaged pelt or an infection or a broken limb, it's cheaper to literally put them in a garbage bag than it is to try to get them veterinary care. So getting further into my research regarding animal ethics in fashion, when we look at fashion media, when we look at magazines and editorials and advertisements, there is a presence of live animal props being used alongside other products that are either made to look like animals or are made from other animals. And this, when I was doing my research, presented a really interesting and troubling contradiction and disconnect. These animal props that are used to sell other products made from animals, it's such a frequent thing that we see that you have to start to question why is this happening? Why is there such a common thing to include live animals alongside clothing and garments made from often the dead bodies of other animals? That is a question that I do a deep dive with my book. And this was the reason I wrote the book. I really wanted to understand, what did it say about us? What does it reveal about our fascination with animals, our feeling of affinity towards animals, but also the things that we do to animals in order to obtain a leather bag or a fur coat or a pair of wool trousers or a feather to put in the cap. And often these images show animals in a way that it would seem like we were respecting or cherishing or admiring those animals. But when you look at the supply chain of fashion, it tells quite a different story about how we feel about animals and how we treat animals in reality. So you can see there's a lot of images like this. And I wanted to know, how far back did this go? Is this just a contemporary phenomenon, or is there some history there? Here's some images from the 80s. So I went back to the 1950s to Vogue Paris, and this was the first fashion editorial that would be considered a modern day fashion editorial, shot by Guy Bourdin. It's called Hat Shocker. And what's shocking to me about this is not that animals are being brutalized all day, every day. This is, that is banal. That is business as usual. But what's shocking is that he named it Hat Shocker to be shocking. That images like this are only shocking when the reality is unveiled. It's only shocking when we are permitted to see it. It's something that is just happening in the background, behind that curtain. Remember the curtain? So this is something to pay careful attention to. Let's go back even further to the 1920s to 1917. These are two Vogue covers. On the left is a model approaching a bird with a feather plume, presenting the plume, and she has a pair of scissors, as if the bird wants to have his plume removed to be added to her dress or her hat. And birds have to be killed often for their plumes. So is the bird suicidal? What is this story that we tell ourselves about what animals want in the context of fashion? They want to become fashion garments. They want to kill themselves in order to be useful to people. On the right-hand side is a polar bear being speared to death. Can you imagine today if there was a Vogue cover with a polar bear being speared to death and bleeding? This would be an outrage. Polar bears are considered very protected and cherished animals, and they represent something regarding the climate crisis and regarding the need to protect threatened and endangered animals. But the context is what matters, the time, how we viewed nature. So images like this, where you have live animal props alongside garments made from other dead animals, this disconnect, this cognitive dissonance that exists very widely in fashion culture and in cultures everywhere, it is ever present in fashion. So even going back to some of the earliest fashion advertisements and some of the earliest fashion plates. This is from the 1700s. On the right-hand side, the model is nuzzling her pet parrot while wearing a plume. So which bird is worthy of being validated, and which bird is killed and turned into a fashion garment? And where do we draw that line? How do we make that decision? Which animals are cared for and which animals are seen as objects and can be killed for profit? So this phenomenon is very, very common. And tropes start to emerge. We start to see similar images used again and again in fashion, and these can call back to common ideas and symbols, like the woman cradling the lamb or the woman cradling the baby goat, and how this references religious iconography. The Lamb of God, Mary and the Lamb, Jesus and the Lamb. This idea of innocence and purity and kindness and protection being used as images to sell sometimes garments made from other sheep. that were brutalized in an industrial system. So these contradicting ideas, the values that we put out visually in images, and then the reality of supply chains and production processes that contradict those values. This is something to pay careful attention to, especially in industries like fashion. Ultimately, looking at all these images, we have to ask, who do we validate and who do we wear? Why is a dog considered valid but a fox is not? There's a disconnect. I use that term cognitive dissonance. There's this uncomfortable closeness between the adored living animal and the animal who has disappeared into a fashion object. But when you look at it, it creates an illusion, an aesthetic illusion, because the model wearing the furry coat, she looks like furry and soft, and is she being the mother sheep cradling this baby, and the baby looks furry and soft and cute, and it all seems to work visually. But once you ask the question, how was that coat made? Suddenly it takes a very dark turn. Suddenly this baby lamb is being cradled in the skins of other dead sheep, and that is quite disturbing. But aesthetically, the truth is not there. So I'm thinking also that this is about ideology. It's not just about fashion and fun images. There's ideology at work here. You may be familiar with Dr. Melanie Joy and her work with carnism, and you can look at fashion through the lens of carnism, and it might sound something like this. In animal wearing cultures around the world, people typically don't think about why they find the skins of some animals disgusting or unacceptable and the skins of other animals normal or beautiful, or why they wear animals at all. Wearing animals is typically seen as a given, not as a choice. Most people don't wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to wear animals today. It just seems to be part of the natural order of our culture. But it is a choice when you start to look at it critically, because every system, every type of manufacturing, every type of production process, these are people making choices. So another force at play is aesthetic irrationality. And this is a really important concept. Aesthetic irrationality means that the way something looks doesn't necessarily pertain to whether it can be analyzed from a ethical or moral standpoint. So just because something is beautiful doesn't always mean that it's good, right? So if you have a beautiful fur coat or a beautiful dress made of feathers, in our culture, we would tend to say beauty is good because it's pretty, because it looks nice, it feels nice, and those are good things. So therefore, something beautiful is the same as something good. But what happens when you start to question how something has been made? What if it's made in a horrifically ugly way? How do we decide whether that is still a good design or a nice garment, a nice dress, a nice jacket? Another way of looking at this is from the reverse. Does ethical correctness rarely overcomes the perceived correctness of aesthetic beauty? So in other words, just because something is made ethically, that doesn't mean in our very visual culture that it's going to win over something that happens to be beautiful or delicious when it comes to something like food. The beauty and the deliciousness become what is perceived as goodness, whereas an ethical production process is sometimes overlooked because it's about knowledge and it's about a way of doing something rather than that final object and the way that it looks. So this is a problem. In my research, there are some observations that I make about the presence of animals in the fashion industry. Observation one is that it has to do with power. The symbolic purpose of animals being utilized in fashion has to do with communicating power, and that has not changed over thousands of years. Let's look at Louis XIV, for example, in this famous painting of him wearing his big, ermine fur cape. Every one of those little black dots is a tail, the tail of an ermine. So you can imagine that a cape like that required the killing of probably a few hundred ermine. So luxury fashion continues to construct identities that reinforce a history of showcasing access to new or arduous trade routes, It demonstrates a command of skilled laborers. It celebrates supremacy over nature. It suggests a connection to the divine or otherworldly. It creates awe and wonder. It makes a spectacle of rarity or scarcity. And most importantly, it discourages and excludes the masses from obtaining these things. So luxury often functions as a very literal form of power. I have this and you don't. I can have access to this and you can't. I can afford this and you can't. So there are other reasons that luxury represents power. There are laws from the 1300s, for example, Edward III. There were laws that made it illegal for many people to be able to wear fur. Only the most powerful royal families and noble people could wear most types of fur. And if you were caught wearing these things, you could be thrown in a dungeon. You could be put to death in some cases, like in the case of wearing the color purple in ancient Rome. If you were wearing Tyrian purple, which they almost drove the Murex snail to extinction in pursuit of this color, you could be put to death. And today, you can see how luxury fur still communicates power. Look at this price tag, $120,000 for a fur coat that doesn't even close. It's not even meant to be functional. It's just meant to be a symbol of power and access and wealth. Another theme with animals in fashion is disinformation. The turning of animals into fashion objects relies on a consumer public kept ignorant about the processes by which animals are farmed, confined, trapped, killed, and processed. The fashion industrial media complex uses an Orwellian framework of disinformation. So Orwell, referring to 1984, this basically telling people the opposite of what is true. Vegetable tanned leather, eco wool. You are an environmental activist if you wear fur. These are ideas that are marketed from the industries that profit from animals' bodies being turned into materials. So we have to look at them really critically. And when you start to look at data around these things, it really breaks those arguments down. It's greenwashing and humane washing. For example, the hot new brand Allbirds that's just gaining tons of attention and has a huge presence in the market right now. They are currently facing a lawsuit over their green claims and over their humane claims. Basically, the life cycle assessment tool Allbirds uses to identify the carbon footprint of its products does not assess the environmental impact beyond the manufacturing of the shoes. So they're not even looking at how sheep are raised as an input into their carbon footprint, which is like leaving out the main ecological impact of producing this footwear. So there are lawsuits going on regarding this brand. But let's look at wool. Let's look at the reality of sustainability in wool. There's 1 billion sheep on the planet, probably more at this point. They make up 25% of all land mammals. They were bred to be here intentionally. That's not natural. So anytime somebody tries to tell you that wool is natural, bring up the 1 billion figure, and that's the furthest thing from a natural sheep population. And wool may be a natural fiber, but it's not sustainable. It requires the clearing of native land for grazing, and that drives biodiversity loss, and it takes away land from indigenous sovereignty. And let's look at the climate impact. Using Australian fiber, producing a wool knit garment emits 27 times more greenhouse gas emissions than a cotton knit garment. And you can look up the data if you want the citations at collectivefashionjustice.org. Another part of wool that people don't talk about is the scouring process, which involves lots of toxic chemicals to strip the oils from the fiber. So again, this is not natural. This is not sustainable. And getting back to grazing, when you clear land to let animals graze, if you're clearing a forest, if you're clearing a prairie or a grassland, these had a diverse biological presence of animals. So according to the Center for Biological Diversity, the ecological costs of livestock grazing exceed that of any other Western land use, and that livestock grazing is the most widespread cause of species endangerment. The most. This isn't just, on the list. So if biodiversity is of concern, if climate change and resource use and land use and the clearing of forests and the clearing of other land is of concern, we have to have a discussion about rewilding those lands, taking them away from grazing operations. Canada goose is another great example of disinformation. Dr. Margaret Robinson, who's a Canadian feminist scholar and is an assistant professor of Indigenous Studies in Halifax, she said basically Canada Goose was trying to get Indigenous artisans to make Canada Goose coats with fur in order to sort of rationalize and justify the brand and their use of fur. And she said, the Canada Goose website plays up a love of the North, but it's the same colonial model we've seen from settler companies again and again: entitlement, charity, and exploitation. The Canada Goose brand is about supporting settler entitlement to travel. Cutting a check to Inuit Tapiriit Katanami doesn't change the colonial dynamic. Another theme in my research is that animals are seen as material. They're not seen as individuals. They're seen as a source of fiber. The animals we love are seen as individuals: our pets, our companions, celebrity animals, the animals able to present individual personality. But the animals we wear are not seen as individuals at all. They're devoid of agency. They're an abstract and mass source of raw materials. But even when we use those animals that we seemingly adore, like dogs, in some cases in history, we have used those animals for materials. So this is a dog fur advertisement from Michigan, from the United States in the early 1900s. Actual dog skin set. You furnish 2 collie dog skins, we do the rest for $10. Here's a mounted dog rug alongside a raccoon rug and a fox rug, and there's a black dogskin coat on the left and a black dogskin glove on the top. So even in cases where the animals that we think are cherished, it just depends on how it's contextualized. Another thing that happens is the objectification, creating aesthetic order. So if you have 100 of the same bag, this idea that the bag is the same, or you see a rack of jackets and they're all designed in the same way and they're all leather, the illusion of sameness, it erases the fact that each of those things were made from a different individual animal who had an inner life, who had a will to live, who probably didn't want to be, who probably resisted being killed to be turned into those objects. But the sameness, the uniformity, the seeming order of that illusion is aesthetic only. It's not that those bags are not the same. Those jackets are not the same. They're different because they came from different individuals. Another thing that happens in fashion is this romanticized evil, naughtiness. You know, when people go and they buy an expensive luxury pair of leather shoes or a crocodile bag or a fur coat, there's this sense of naughtiness, of transgression, of like, ooh, I'm so bad that I did this, and it's so expensive, and I know it's cruel, and sometimes that cruelty plays into the ego. They want it to be cruel, but they want it to be cruel in an abstract way. They don't want to look at the real cruelty. They don't want to look at the literal undercover investigation of what's happening to those animals. They like the Hollywood villain idea of cruelty, the power, the mystery, the shadowiness, the eccentricity. These archetypes of man-eater, siren, black widow, femme fatale being associated with wearing a fur coat. This has, in one way, it's empowering, but when you look at the production process, again, when you lift that curtain, it really contradicts those archetypes of empowerment. It's much more about ruthlessness and brutality and much less to do with being an empowered individual, because when it comes to being bad or being evil, it's always easier to do evil than good, easier to hurt another in ways that will haunt them for the rest of their lives than provide a comparable amount of good. This is what the philosopher Lars Svensson says. He's a contemporary philosopher. So maybe that's why naughty and evil archetypes are so popular in fashion, because evil power is a path of easy, least resistance to power. You don't have to do work to be a villain. If you want to be a hero, it requires knowledge and consistency and values and work and following through, and that's a lot. Who wants to do all that work when you can just have power and, you know, be bonkers, be a villain? Another theme is the idea that animals are gifts of nature. Animals appearing in fashion media are depicted as willing agents provided by nature as gifts and rewards to humans who have inherited or transcended nature and thus deserve those gifts. And you can see that language that's used in old advertisements for things like the International Fur Store, where these animals, these living animals, are advertising their own bodies, their own skins, and it says beautiful furs for Christmas presents and New Year's gifts. And then on the right-hand side is an image of a woman with all the animals emerging from the forest, presenting themselves to her as gifts to be useful. This is a French a beautifully illustrated French fur catalog from the early 1900s, and basically what you all probably can read French better than I can, but on the left, essentially what it says is on the snowy steppe, the fox is captured through the import of his obscure death, and by gestures of grace and elegance, he will know triumph. You know, this is kind of very ethereal poetry, French poetry, but what they're saying is that the fox has no meaning until it becomes a fur coat. The fox's life doesn't have any importance or meaning on its own. Only when it is turned into something that is useful and appreciated by human beings is it something that's worth looking at, worth valuing. And that's a really dark reality of the way that people view animals. Another theme are suicidal. They want to be turned into fashion objects. In many cases, animals used to sell fashion are depicted as aspiring to become clothing, and by implication, killed. In these suicidal depictions, animals offer up their own bodies to be turned into fashion objects in order to achieve a status that is superior because it is assigned human meaning. So, you know, here are these kangaroos just thrilled to be turned into kangaroo shoes, and this sheep, look how happy, being wound up into a ball of yarn. So there are also ethical implications to using animals in fashion. Here's another trigger warning for this section. It depicts animal cruelty. Just doing a time check. So I'm going to skip over this because we don't have time, but the ethical implications of using animals, often when you see something really cruel going on in the fur industry or the leather industry or, you know, any animal industry, sometimes that cruelty is very much tied to a pursuit of maximizing profits. So a tool like this is a electrocution device. On fox farms, this device is used to anally or vaginally electrocute foxes to death. And it isn't that a sadist came up with this concept of a really horrific way to kill foxes. It's that somebody trying to maximize profits came up with this way to kill animals. That it is by a cheap way to kill and a way that doesn't damage the pelts. This is what they ended up with. It's affordable, it's efficient, and it doesn't damage the pelt. And so sometimes when you see these really cruel practices, you always have to ask yourself, how does this make them more money? And it isn't the death that is always the worst part of some of these animal industries. Every year, more than 100 million animals are killed for their fur, and it is the life, or if you can call it that, the languishing inside these wire cages. A fox is an animal that evolved over millions of years to run, to play, to dig, to explore, to socialize, to hunt. And you confine that animal to a small wire cage for its entire existence, and that has to be torturous. And if it gets an infection, it's untreated, and if it gets injured, it isn't taken care of. And sometimes it is that life that is even worse than a death by electrocution. There have been investigations In as recently as the year 2020 in China, this is a mountain of animal carcasses for the fur industry. In Finland, there are organizations that have uncovered breeding animals to have extra skin, which creates even more suffering for them in order to further profit. In 2020, Denmark culled all of its 17 million mink because of the spread of a mutated coronavirus that posed a threat to vaccines. In the exotic skins industry, like snake skin, they inflate snakes to death with an air compressor because when you stretch out an animal like a balloon, you get more surface area of the skin, so you make more money per snake. They're stretching out the skin so they can sell it for a higher price. So this killing method is incredibly cruel, but it increases profit. There's been ostrich leather investigations, cow leather investigations, crocodile factory farm investigations in Zimbabwe and Texas. There have been exposés on over 100 major wool operations in the United States, Australia, Argentina, Scotland, England, and Chile. And in all of these investigations, they show the same thing in the shearing process, that shearers are paid by volume. They're not paid by hour, so they rush. And in that rushing, they're fighting these animals who are prey animals and don't want to be held down or pinned down, and they lose their patience. And they hit them with the shears, and they kick them, and they slam them to the ground, and they break their bones sometimes, and they lacerate them with the shears. And it is just, it's systemized cruelty. It inevitably results in cruelty because of the design of the system. So these are things that are considered business as usual. Even on humane, so-called humane farms, they find similar cruelties that are considered standard industry practices. Tail docking with a hot blade, chopping lambs' tails off with a hot blade, castration, lacerating during the shearing process. These are considered just business as usual, so they're not even looked at through the lens of cruelty. There have been 70 Spanish rabbit farms investigated in 2015 and found similar levels of cruelty. There have been rabbit farm investigations in China, Angora investigations, even silk investigations where silkworms are boiled alive inside of their cocoons. Now let's go back to ask that question. How does this cruel form of silk making make more profit? Well, think about it. A cocoon is one singular strand of silk wound around and around and around and around. So if you allow the moth to chew through that and escape, it breaks the strand. And then you end up with a fabric that looks a lot more like linen. It looks more rough and less shiny. So you have to boil the worms inside the cocoon to maintain those long, long threads that result in the most luxurious and shiny and profitable forms of silk. Similar situation with the down industry. So sorry for all of that upsetting images and darkness. Let's talk about some positive stuff to finish up. So conclusions and solutions. The quest for cruelty-free fashion is nothing new. As early as the 1800s, you can see advertisements in London for Humana footwear. They didn't call it vegan fashion then. They didn't call it, plant-based or ethical fashion. They called it humanitarian fashion or hygienic fashion. But it's the same idea: imitation leather made of vegetable matter. Humana boots are humanitarian, comfortable, and economical. I would love to find some of these actual pieces if they exist in a, somewhere in London. I'm sure somebody has one in their attic or basement. Fur substitutes for humanitarians. There was faux fur. There were faux feathers, faux reindeer gloves. There was even a humane dress league in London in the early 1900s. So this pursuit is nothing new. And also the criticism of what's happening to animals in the fashion industry, that is also nothing new. Comics depicting the reason why birds are being driven to extinction for their feathers and hunting for plumes, and the cruelty of what's happening to animals in fur farms. These are things that people have been writing about and talking about for a long time. And even today, you can see there's a huge number of brands and stores and companies that have banned fur and banned exotic skins, and it's a domino effect. More and more are doing it. And laws that are being passed there's also a cascade of fur sales bans, fur farming bans, fur farming prohibitions, measures to make fur farming and fur sales more difficult all throughout Europe and Asia, and even most recently in 2021, the country of Israel was the first country in the world to completely ban the sales of fur. So hopefully we'll see more countries doing that. The entire state of California in the United States has banned the sales of new fur. So this is really great that a trend like this is happening. So let's talk about what's happening in innovation. Circumfauna. This is a term I came up with. It means bypassing animal inputs in fashion. You can use it for any industry, really. Circumfaunal food, circumfaunal fashion, the intent to bypass animal inputs. So we have things like Koba, which is faux fur made from coconut oil and corn oil. We've got Bolt Threads making biosynthetic silk. So these are silk proteins grown in the laboratory with no worms or spiders involved in the process. We've got mushroom leather made from mycelium. We've got companies like MicroWorks making mushroom leather, and Spiber making biosynthetic silk. Furoid is doing lab-grown fur. Pangaea uses a down alternative that's made from flowers. Primaloft makes a biodegradable and recyclable alternative to down. Companies like May West use milkweed as a down alternative. This is a very eco-friendly and low processing alternative to feathers. There's companies that make cashmere from soybean husks, that make nylon from recycled carpets and recycled fishing nets. People making fiber from algae, a company called Alginate. AmSilk also has biosynthetic silk. Lab-grown leather from companies like Modern Meadow. They have a product called Zoa, which is made from skin cells that are grown in the laboratory. So no cow had to be slaughtered in order to achieve a real biological leather. Vitro Labs has similar technology using cellular agriculture. Provenance is a similar technology. Geltor makes collagen, lab-grown collagen-based leather and cosmetics. Natural fiber welding uses natural rubber and the waste of the agriculture industry, so things like corn husks and wheat husks, to make leather. Company called FabOrg makes a vegan wool that is made from milkweed. Vigia uses the byproducts of winemaking, grape marc, to make leather. Similar technology at Frumat. Orange Fiber uses citrus peels like grapefruit and oranges and lemons and limes to make beautiful, luxurious fibers like cashmere and silk. EcoPel recycles water bottles and soda bottles to make faux fur. So there's so many companies, Deserto, Cactus Leather, Pinatex, Pineapple Leather. Ultimately, when it comes to the use of animals in fashion, it's not just a personal choice. It's not just about you and your opinion and me and my opinion. There's a third perspective that is systematically left out of the conversation, and that's the animal's perspective. Animals have a valid perspective. So a personal choice can't have a victim. This is not an issue that's about personal choice. It's about justice. It's about validating a systematically invalidated perspective. For me, it's not a matter of how animals are used. It's a matter that they are used. Every major factory farm, every massive scaled animal operation, started as a small operation at some point in history. So it's if profits and scaling and maximizing efficiency are going to be the goal, then I believe that animals don't belong in the fashion production system or any industrial system, because it will inevitably result in cruelty. This is an aerial view of a fur farm. In every one of those sheds are thousands of animals living in cages. Animals don't belong in systems like this. It's inevitably cruel. And this is an issue that is intersectional. It's not just about the animals. It's about workers and workers' rights. It's about land rights. It's about indigenous sovereignty. It's about the environment. It's about politics and law. This is an issue that's not just about fashion and the way clothes look and the way clothes are made. It touches everything. If you want to get in touch with me, this is my my Instagram handles. Brave Gentleman is my brand. The Discerning Brute is my personal. And I will stop sharing and take some questions.
Good job, Joshua. Thank you so much. So informative. Wow, I am amazed. I started my career in fashion myself and had no idea the implications that animals had in the industry. I was blind to it. I chose to be blind to it. When I became vegan 13 years ago, what an eye-opener. And I was overwhelmed by the guilt that I had building several businesses on the backs of animals. But it's amazing that you offer solutions and not just pointing at the actual problems. We do have a comment from Catherine Baker. She's shocked by the images of both live and dead animals used in the fashion industry and magazines. Rarely look at those magazines that didn't realize that live animals were used so frequently. So
yeah, it's one of those things where you don't, until you kind of pay attention and look for it, you don't really notice it because it's used so frequently everywhere. We use animals as props in in every advertisement you can think of because they know that people are so drawn to looking at animals. It grabs eyes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And were you always vegan when you started your career in fashion, or?
I have been vegan for about 25 years. Okay. So yeah, when I got into fashion, it was to change fashion. I got into the industry because I wanted to change the industry.
Great. That's amazing. And so I have a question now from Diva Yancourt. What do you think about secondhand animal garments, wool specifically?
You know, it's one of those issues where I feel like it can be a gray area in some places. So for example, if I go to a thrift store and I buy, a sweater that is a cotton wool blend, it might not, it's not advertising to the world. This is an animal fiber. Use animals as a source of materials. So in a case like that, I don't know if it's that big of a deal. My rule is that anything that is promoting the idea that animals are an acceptable source of materials is not something that we should be wearing, because I don't see animals as beings that are their bodies are not to be mined for materials. So it symbolizes something. Like I would never wear vintage fur. Just because it's used, it doesn't change the symbol.
Right.
The fact that it's been repurposed or handed down, it's your grandmother's, it's your mother's, and you have it now. It doesn't change the symbol of what that fur coat represents, and that represents a very specific idea about what animals' place is in our culture, how we value them, whether it is acceptable to turn their bodies into garments. And I don't believe it is. I see something like a fur coat similar to the way that I would see something like a hate symbol, where it represents a form of violence and a form of oppression and exploitation that I don't want to perpetuate. So, use your I would use common sense with thrift stores and vintage. If something is really obviously, an animal material, then don't make it look good.
Right.
If something is like, if you find a pair of socks that's like, 10% wool, like, come on, like nobody's gonna know, and it is vintage, it is being reused. So yeah, use some of that common sense.
Yeah, fantastic.
I hope that's helpful.
Absolutely. What do you think of all the, well, I would almost call it a trend, because it is the fashion industry dropping fur from their roster of product being used in making their coats?
Sorry, say that again?
So what do you think of the trend within the industry of giving up fur?
Yeah.
Obviously, it's a good thing.
It's very good. I think that when I think of, and I think I'll also answer Catherine's question as I'm talking about this when it comes to fake fur.
Right.
I really see faux fur as an important step in the right direction, because it's much easier to change inputs into production systems than it is to change people's desires.
Right.
Like the reason we have so many very realistic vegan burgers and vegan hot dogs and vegan cheese, it isn't because we necessarily need those things. We can be fine on a whole foods plant-based diet, but it's very difficult to change people's associations and around taste and desire and what they crave and what is nostalgic for them and what is meaningful to them. So I look at it like a harm reduction approach. That faux fur is a harm reduction approach to real fur. And I think it's important it exists because there will be people who want the look of a fur coat, and it's going to be far easier to say, here, use this. It looks exactly the same and it performs better and no one had to die for it. But there is a history, as Catherine mentioned, some brands labeling something faux fur and it turned out to be real fur. And that is a supply chain and transparency problem that needs to be legislated and needs to have better laws around labeling requirements and production transparency. Thankfully, a lot of the newer faux fur brands like Koba, like EcoPel, these are labels that you can trust because you know that what they're doing, they have an agenda. They have a sustainability and ethics agenda. So they would never accidentally put dog fur on a coat and claim that it's faux fur.
Right. Catherine's also saying, very interesting, your answer about faux fur. A lot of vegans I've met on social media are strongly opposed to it. She's noticed.
I have a lot of opinions that are different than a lot of social media vegans. So,
but based on your input of recycled fur, I think it's the same. I mean, if a faux fur represents fur, why promote it, right? Personally, as a vegan, someone who's promoting a cruelty-free lifestyle.
Again, it comes down to because it's a visual medium, it gets complicated, and you have to consider more than just. You can't look at it in such a black and white way. You have to look at it in a very granular way. And I think what data and social research shows is that people are much more willing to make ethical changes if those changes are comfortable and familiar. So while something might seem like the right choice, it isn't always the most effective choice. Being correct and being effective are very different things. You can look at it as a spectrum or as sort of like a Venn diagram of effectiveness and correctness, and where those overlap are often the things we should be doing. And those things we should be doing are sometimes counterintuitive. They go against what we think is the most correct or the right way to do something. So we should, I think as activists and as vegans, we need to look at social research much more carefully and examine our tactics and our methods.
Right.
Yeah.
Catherine's also saying you see a lot of opposition to faux leather.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not in this to be a Puritan. I'm not trying to. I'm not puritanical. I want to change the industry. I want people who would otherwise go buy a pair of leather boots to buy my boots. And if that means that my boots have to look like leather, and that's going to save some animals, like if I make some vegans upset, I don't care. It's not for them. It's not. I'm not doing it to appeal to them. I'm doing it to show that you can have beautiful footwear that looks like the stuff that people are already looking for and already shopping for, and that's going to be so much easier than trying to convince a luxury fashion customer to completely change their desires and their aesthetics and the things that they're drawn to. That's a much more difficult battle to fight.
Right. Well, I mean, in my own career in the industry, in the fashion industry, I've dealt with a lot of luxury brands that are completely comparable to what you do. I mean, I'm familiar with what you do. I've been following you for years. Your footwear is fantastic.
Thank you.
Brave Gentleman is incredible product and value for what it is. People may, generally speaking, vegans and activists may find it a little expensive, but we kind of live a life that's a little less, accented on luxury goods. But by comparison to the same brands in the Italian goods, luxury goods market, your prices are quite reasonable.
Yes. It's about, if you look at it in comparison to other luxury brands, my stuff would be considered more affordable, But I'm not delusional. I realize that $300 for a pair of boots for most people, that's a lot. That's a lot of money. And we live in a society, unfortunately, where we have been trained to assume that clothes should be cheap, but that cheapness comes at a cost. The only way that something can be very cheap is if at some point in the supply chain, workers are being exploited, whether it's sweatshops or child labor or, child slave cotton pickers, or, this is all still happening. It's just happening out of sight. The only way you can arrive at a $25 pair of shoes or a $50 pair of shoes is if either those shoes are being made in such massive volumes with such cheap materials, or that at some point along the supply chain, people are being exploited, animals are being harmed, somebody's getting screwed over. The reason why things cost more money when it comes to ethical brands is because at every stage of the supply chain, workers are being paid fairly. Innovative materials are being invested in, and then you end up at a retail price that just is inevitably going to be more expensive because it's an investment in all of those systems. So the way we identify as consumers, I hate that term consumers, because a consumer is a passive receptacle, whereas a citizen or an investor, you're an active participant. So I really encourage people to see yourselves as citizen investors when you're shopping, not as consumers, because every dollar that you spend, you're investing in a system. And if you want to see that system flourish, then keep investing in that system. If you want to see new systems flourish, you have to invest in those systems too. So, but yeah, it's a bit of a paradox when it comes to the price point of ethical fashion. It is more expensive. What I recommend for people, and this is what I do in my own personal life, about 80 to 90% of my wardrobe is from thrift stores. And then about 10, 20% of my wardrobe is one or two brands that I really believe in what they're doing. And I'll save up and buy one thing from them in order to support that brand or to invest in that supply chain, that system. And that's a good way to approach it. And you end up spending the same amount of money you would if you buy your whole wardrobe at a high street store or a fast fashion store. You just kind of change the ratio of thrift to ethical fashion, and it can work out. It's a good way of looking at it. Oh, I see another question.
So the durability of faux leather is very variable, and the products are often made of petroleum products, which are not good for the environment. We hear that a lot. What's that?
Yeah. What I say to that is the first thing I'll say is that the leather industry, the cow leather industry, is completely fossil fuel dependent. It takes about just under 300 gallons of fossil fuels to raise one typical steer. So one typical steer will yield 7 pounds of leather. 300 gallons of fossil fuels to make 7 pounds of leather. That is much more fossil fuels than required to make vegan leather. The ratio is just incomparable. So the first thing to throw out the window is the idea that leather is a natural product, that it's free of fossil fuels, that it's not coated in PVC, not coated in polyurethane, which it is, that it's not colored with, petrochemical dyes, that these are parts of the industry that the leather industry has spent a lot of money and marketing efforts to greenwash. They want you to think it's just skin. It's going to biodegrade. Throw it in the compost pile. Like, no, it won't biodegrade. Even the leather industry's own data shows that even vegetable tanned leather, which is, a term we could get into at another time, even vegetable tanned leather doesn't fully biodegrade. Anyway, so what I would say is that certain faux leathers, if they're made, there are better quality ones that are made in Europe under certain standards that are more durable than leather. They last longer, they're more weather resistant, they breathe, they're flexible, they break in, and they have a much smaller ecological impact. But I agree, plastic is a problem, fossil fuels is a problem, it has to be addressed. And there are so many innovations, as I showed in my presentation, that we will soon be transitioning to. We will have plant-based, we'll have bioplastic leather, biosynthetic leather, biodegradable plant-based leathers. The industry and the technology is accelerating exponentially right now. So
Fantastic.
right in this moment, it is more sustainable to buy even the most conventional polyurethane pair of vegan shoes than it is to buy even the most sustainable claim around vegetable tanned leather.
Yeah,
exactly. And that's what the data shows.
Beautiful. Let's do it. So we can get your shoes on your website?
Yeah. bravegentleman.com. This is not an advertisement.
Joshua, I love your shoes. I'm going to get a pair. You already sold out of the red one, size 41. If you get another pair, let me know.
Sorry.
Thank you so much, Joshua. I used to say peace starts on your plate, but it also starts on your back. And thank you for sharing your presentation with us today. I think it made a world of difference for me, even who's been in the industry for such a long time. And I'm sure many people will be able to watch it going forward. Thank you so much. Keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate it. I am just going to get a quick screen grab so I can put it on social media and say hi. So here, wave.
There we go. Bye-bye.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Feel free to shoot me a message on Instagram if you have any follow-up questions. Thank you, Rick, and thanks to the Montreal Veg Fest. Really appreciate it, you guys. Bye-bye.